Wait, Tim, are you okay with us recording this?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay.
Does that work? Everyone see it?
Yeah, it's great.
So I'm gonna stop the share.
Hey, Scott. Tim, this is our ECM administrator, Scott Gustafson.
Hey, Sergey.
Hello.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for participating in this.
Yeah, you have a good Norwegian name.
Oh, yeah, sure do.
No problem. So this is the ECM, right? It's the building that's right at the non-denominational church at the right by the Orion.
Yep.
Cool.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So Sergey and I both work at Lifespan Institute, but we also have this ECM connection. I'm on the board of the ECM, and when I was a student, I lived at the ECM. There's a student cooperative in the basement of the ECM. So
Cool. Is that where you're living, Sergey, or no?
Yeah, I'm actually living in Drew's old room.
Ah, cool. Cool.
Got a lot of history.
How many people are in the in the church?
There are 6 little apartments.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But how many students and what's the general, like, how many people in general do you serve?
Well, we have like a bunch of different activities, but I think probably the biggest one is there's a Thursday lunch that it's like a free vegetarian lunch that was getting like 100 to 200 people pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
But we've had to, of course, like curtail like almost all the activities.
Yeah, Veggie Lunch is, I think, probably our most popular and longest running program. Probably, I don't know, 40 years maybe of serving
Wow.
this meal every week
Really?
to like 150 to 200 people. So,
Wow.
And then, I mean, we have a bunch of other programs like Community Forum, which I think is now like 80 years old. So probably the longest running speaker series.
Because I came to KU in 2018, and though maybe one bright side, I feel like coming out of it, well, whenever this pandemic kind of subsides a little bit, I feel like there's gonna be a big reset button. So like, there's all these like community like knowledge that I don't know about, right? But I feel like everything's gonna get reset, and like it'll be like, oh, look at all these new like these different events that we have to like publicize so everyone knows about.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of looking for, if there's like things I'm like, okay, that'll be really cool, because I'm always like the outsider of the community, like, oh, I just didn't know that existed. So
yeah, I think in a lot of ways, like everyone will feel like an outsider.
yeah,
I'll just be like starting from scratch with all these like, cool things that have been sort of put on the back burner.
so it'd be cool, like, I mean, because it'll be like a way to like reset, and everyone would be like, okay, I didn't know about that, or maybe it's giving everyone a chance to rethink like a particular thing that's like, okay, that wasn't working, but we can adapt it. So I'm trying to be an optimist about some of those things.
Yeah, I started at the ECM 10 days before the stay-at-home order, which has made my job significantly different than the one that I was hired for.
Yeah.
But it's also given me a chance to like really evaluate like what we're doing and what we should be doing. And then it's great when Sergey moved in and offered to take on Community Forum, which is a lot of effort to plan a speaker series. So.
Yeah. How many speakers do you have lined up? Do you have any more people lined up, Sergey?
We just have 3 more lined up for the rest of the semester, and then we need to plan our spring one.
Cool.
We kind of started in the middle of the semester talking about this and a little bit on the fly.
I just lost her name. I'll send you some people. If you need some ideas, I can send you some ideas of people around KU that might be really good to think about.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Because I think Sarah Deer, she's like in the women's studies. She's won like a number of grants and really cool prizes. She's got a really good. She's pretty good. She might be someone to talk to.
Sarah Deer.
Yeah, I think in the last few years, the organizers were maybe doing it once a month. But Sergey and I just this morning were looking at the schedule from 2011, and they were doing it every week.
Oh.
And just, yeah, with the variety of speakers, it was really fascinating. Like people from the university, and then some people who were involved like in local politics, but then also some like very sort of niche presentations, like on the history of bananas. So depending on how much time Sergey has available, it'd be great to get it back to once a week.
The bananas are interesting, right? We're all eating the same banana. They're all genetic copies.
Yeah.
We have a problem. I don't know beyond that. That's all I know. That's my useless fact of bananas.
Well, eventually it'll be the history of the banana people ate and no one and don't have anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it'll be. I think there'll be someday. Like, I mean, when I was growing up, there was like red delicious apples and golden delicious, and there's just 2 apples, and now there's like this huge variety. And like, I'm optimistic, like it'll be like this kind of like opening up of bananas. I don't know if it's possible. But.
Yeah, definitely. Like there's apples and oranges. There's so many types of these particular fruits, but there's only one banana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I lived in Berlin for a while, and the person I would go to the market that was down the street from me, and I got to know it was the potato guy, and there was like in Germany they have all these varieties of potatoes, and each had a name, and he would tell me which one was good this time and how to cook each one.
Nice. Yeah, they have street markets there. Like that's pretty big in Berlin, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of nice, cool markets. I don't know what they're doing now, but I was actually thinking about him the other day when I was like hoping that they've kind of figured out new ways around it. So.
Yeah.
Well, Sergey, you should track him down. He'd be a good speaker for us.
I know a little bit of German, so it might work.
Okay. Great. So Tim, where did you come from?
I've been a little bit everywhere, but I actually grew up in the Midwest. Kansas is like one of my last states to check off for living in the Midwest. Like, okay. I really only have Ohio and South Dakota and North Dakota to go. So, yeah.
I read that Kansas is 49th in tourism and North Dakota's is 50th.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. But I haven't been to North Dakota very often, but I have been there. So yeah, I'm a Midwest kid, and then but I went to I did my Ph.D. at University of Maryland, and then the fun thing is I guess I've moved back and forth to Europe like twice. So we moved to Switzerland after I got my PhD, and then we came back, and then we moved to Germany, and then we came back. So if you need advice on how to do that, I guess I can tell you how to do that.
I don't think I'm moving to Europe anytime soon.
No,
So a good friend of mine, though, just a year ago, moved to Switzerland.
Did he?
Mm-hmm. Very suddenly as well, and he has 2 kids. So
it's beautiful. It's very expensive, but it's like an unbelievable place to live. Really cool.
Yeah, those are all the exact same things that he said.
Yeah, I mean, the expenses are just like crazy. I was when I was in Germany, I took a student there because I got invited to give a talk, and she came with me, and they took me out to dinner, and she ordered a beer. She's from Germany, and she ordered a beer, and in Switzerland, the beer is like a little tiny glass, and it was like I don't know, it'd be like 14. It was like 12 or 14 euros, and she was really funny. She was like, "This is a beer?" Like she was like thinking of this like,
Oh, yeah.
like a stein, but in Switzerland, it's tiny. You savor everything.
Yeah, I've been to Switzerland once. I was on my way back from 6 months in Tanzania,
Ah,
and I'd spent a couple of weeks in Italy, and then went to Switzerland for a few days. And there was a Mexican restaurant, and I was just like, "Well, I'm gonna try this." It might have been the worst meal I've ever had.
yeah. You shouldn't do Mexican in Switzerland.
No.
And in fact, you should probably like Germany in general. It's not very good. Hello.
Can you say hi?
Hi.
Hi. Okay. Well, looks like people are hopping in, so we can get started in a few minutes. Tim, have you updated your presentation on the tools or?
Similar tools. I update the plots, which is
Nice.
kind of disheartening actually, but it's okay. Like, you need a snowy scene behind you, Sergey, not a rainbow.
Yeah, need a freezing rain one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if KU had a snowy background. You did look.
Hey, on Twitter today, they had something like October. It had snow. For the Friday forum, we're gonna try to do a happy hour Friday, but a Halloween Zoom,
Mhm.
which is kind of cool because the idea is you do a costume and then you set up your background
Mhm.
to kind of work with your costume, right? So you could be like a sports announcer or whatever, you know. You could be a game show host and have like squares and all that stuff.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, I think we can probably get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fall 2020 University-Community Forum, hosted by the Ecumenical Campus Ministries. My name's Sergey, and I help coordinate the forum along with Scott, who is our ECM administrator, and Drew, who is a volunteer for the ECM. Since this is our first forum of the year, I wanted to welcome everyone, part of the Lawrence and the broader Kansas community, folks from the University of Kansas, and any friends of the ECM for coming. We appreciate you attending our first forum of the year. To give you an idea of how this virtual forum is going to work, we'll be following a format where the speaker will have 45 minutes to give their talk, followed by whatever remaining time we have dedicated for questions and answers. We've also selected a core group of ECM affiliated folks to be able to turn their video on to make this as close to a live seminar experience as possible. If you have any questions for Dr. Pleskac, please reserve them until the Q&A session at the very end, and please keep yourselves muted until that time. Before I introduce today's speaker, I wanted to briefly say a few words about the forum. The University-Community Forum has been bringing together the KU and Lawrence communities since the 1940s. This program hosts presentations by faculty, students, and community members to educate and facilitate dialogue on current ideas and events that shape our world and discourse. And finally, I will introduce our speaker. Dr. Tim Pleskac is a professor of psychology, where he directs the KU Behavioral Science Laboratory. He studies how people make judgments and decisions, how these processes shape behavior at the individual, group, and organizational level, and how we can help people make better judgments and decisions. He investigates these questions with computational modeling and methods from the behavioral and neurosciences. And his work has been well recognized, winning the Young Investigator Award from the Society for Judgment and Decision Making, the Scientific Recognition Award from the European Association for Decision Making, and the National Science Foundation's CAREER Award. At KU, he is on a personal mission to build a data science program that offers students from all backgrounds the opportunity to help develop data-driven solutions for problems and questions that they care about. When he is not at his desk, you can find him running, biking, rowing, or out in the woods, fishing or hunting. In a parallel world, he owns his own bike shop somewhere in the Midwestern US, hopefully Kansas. And now I'll give it off to our speaker, Dr. Tim Pleskac.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to join you, and I look forward to hearing more about what kind of talks are also going on in future ones. So I'm happy to kick this off. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Sergey gave a good introduction, so I'm not going to go into that. So again, it's behavioral science laboratory is what I run here. And we're really interested about how people make decisions and how we can help them make better decisions. And you'll see aspects where I think we can actually speak to questions about data science as well. So I'm happy to take any of those questions or comments later. So the question I want to take up today is, how do we deal with uncertainty? The word uncertainty has gained a lot of prevalence as of late because we are all facing a new virus, or now maybe it's sort of new, I guess, at this point. And this virus is, I think it's something really unique that we've never, of course it's unique, but we've never really thought about it this way, is that there's so many like known unknowns, right? It's a new virus. There's just so many known unknowns we don't know. And those vastly outweigh the known knowns. And those also, let alone vastly, probably outweigh the unknown unknowns. We're all entering this place where now we're going into like winter, right? And we don't know how the virus is going to work when we're back indoors and things like that. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the air. And this is a topic, uncertainty, that my colleagues and I have been working on. And when the work we've been working on is actually more general about how we deal with uncertainty. And the way to kind of think about the way we think about this is we think of you, the person, dealing with uncertainty as kind of a shade tree mechanic, right? So we're a shade tree mechanic where the car breaks down and you pull it up. Maybe it's under a shady spot, maybe not, maybe it's in your garage, right? And you get you have a set of tools and you have to solve them, right? You probably all have dealt with this in some way. Maybe it's not about a car, but maybe it's about a printer, a computer, your phone. You have a set of tools on hand and you think, okay, how can I solve this problem with what I have on hand? And so we kind of think of you, the person, as a shade tree mechanic. And if you take that analogy further, then you think of that means the mind is akin to a toolbox, right? A toolbox that we reach in and grab a tool to solve or to address the problem. So the mechanic is solving it with his or her pickup, but maybe now you have a problem about thinking about, how do I think about a positive test, right, from on COVID-19. So how do I deal with that? And there's a set of tools that we've all kind of developed and honed Some of us have different toolboxes, right? A mechanic has a mechanic's toolbox, woodworking has a different toolbox, and the same thing with different people. And we also have friends that we might consult. So you can see that you kind of think about the mind as a toolbox. And so what I want to do today is give you a set of tips that maybe help you think about the tools you have at hand to deal with risk and uncertainty that we're all facing in this pandemic. Today I'll go through about 4 tools. I should state that my expertise is not in public health. My expertise is in behavioral economics. So my answers will reflect what we know from that domain. I'll try to give you some useful sites at the end that I've tried over the past 6 months or so to better learn and understand about the pandemic. So I need to preface that. So we're going to go through 4 tips. Okay, and hopefully along the way, you'll see that I'm going to give you 4 tips, and maybe along the way, I'm going to teach you a little bit about how the mind works as well. So my first tip is going to start out with a question based off of the weather forecast. So here's the weather forecast that was out yesterday. So there was an 85% chance of snow yesterday. It snowed. But now you can see snow, here's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. This is from the Kansas City Star. Now, something that's interesting is we've all become accustomed to is this probability about the chance of precipitation that's in the forecast, right? So today's 25%, tomorrow's 25% chance of precipitation. When I teach behavioral economics in my classes, I ask my students to imagine the day when there wasn't a probability associated with that. And in fact, that was a very real thing. It wasn't until 1965 that weather forecasters started to include probabilities with their forecasts. And so that's interesting to think about what that means and how that would be, right? But we've all become in tune, and it would be weird, right? If it just said, yep, it's going to rain. Nope, it's not going to rain tomorrow. Right? We all expect some sort of forecast or probabilistic prediction about that. Now, what I want to ask you now is, what does a 30% chance of rain tomorrow mean? So does it mean A, it will rain tomorrow in 30% of the region? B, it will rain tomorrow for 30% of the time? Or C, it will rain tomorrow on 30% of the days like tomorrow? So if you want, you could put it up in the chat, put up what you think each one means. I have the chat on. You guys can put up an answer if you want. I'll give you a second. So does it mean A, it'll rain 30% of the region, B, it'll rain tomorrow for 30% of the time, or C, it'll rain tomorrow on 30% of days like tomorrow? Good. Well, so we have a couple of responses, right? So you see that it's about C, right? That, in fact, is the right answer. And it's interesting to think about why that is. So here, by the way, is the official definition from the National Weather Service. I put it in terms of 30% chance of rain. Means a 30% chance of precipitation tomorrow means that for 10 days that have weather conditions exactly like today, on the next day, at least 0.01 inches of rain will fall somewhere in the region in 3 of them, right? So roughly that means, right, that it's got this day aspect. For 10 days that have weather conditions exactly like today, on the next day, at least 0.01 inches of rain will fall somewhere in the region in 3 of them. So there's 3 of those days. So it has this interpretation. This is interesting, and the reason I asked that is now this study's a little bit older. It's about 15 years old, but it shows you that when they asked this question around the world, people had different responses. So you can see New York is like what we saw, where a lot of people said 30% of days like tomorrow, the yellow. But now look at Amsterdam. When they asked people in Amsterdam what it means, then that meant that about over half of them said it meant time. That is, just to go back, it will rain tomorrow for 30% of the time. That's interesting, right? If you think about what that means, right? That means that like out of 24 hours, 8 hours it's going to rain, right? If you take that interpretation. Here's Berlin. I once lived in Berlin for a while. You can see that there's kind of a split. Here's Athens. Athens is almost an equal split between the different answers. Part of the reason that is, right, potentially, is that actually in Athens at that time, it still wasn't customary to include a probabilistic forecast with the precipitation forecast. Okay, so there's different variabilities, and as I kind of hinted, right, the different interpretations mean different things. So if you think it's 30% of the time, then that means like if you're planning a picnic, right, that means that you're like, well, it's going to rain tomorrow, so I should just postpone. But if you think it's 30% of the days, 3 out of the 10 days, then you might say, well, I could probably pull it off. I don't know if it's going to rain or not on tomorrow. 3 out of 10 times it will. And if you mean it's like the region, that means it's going to rain tomorrow, but in 30% of the region, right? So this impacts the behaviors and how we make decisions. This is the important tip that I want to give you, right, is that we have this tool called probability that we've all kind of gotten used to using to think about risk and uncertainty, but we don't know, it's a little bit hard to think about and use. And the tip I want to give you is when you get a probability, you want to ask, when you get a probability, ask of what, right? So when it's about 30% chance of rain, you want to say of what? 30% of what? Of the days like tomorrow, of the time, of the region. So when you get a probability, ask, hey, what does that mean? What's the reference class? This is important in the context of the pandemic, right? We're getting all sorts of statistics that are shown to us, right, of the probability of contracting the virus. And I highlight this in that what we've come to appreciate and what's difficult about this pandemic, right, is that it's disproportionately hitting different populations. So there's the statistics from the CDC that was updated in August. They don't have new statistics updated, but you can see American Indian about 2.8 times higher than whites, Asians 1.1, Black or African Americans 2.6. And it's not just cases, it's impacting hospitalizations and also death rates, right? So when we're talking about those probabilities, ask, when someone says, hey, the probability of contracting this is what? Is this? Ask them, where's that reference class? Because that can help you think about, under what places do I think I'm going to get that? Or what under what reference class? And it can highlight these disparities that we're seeing. So that's the first hint. The second hint is going to be is the following: put risks in absolute numbers. Okay, so here's I'm going to illustrate this with something that we're all familiar with now: testing. So here's the kind of the swab test, PCR test, and I've got a word problem for you, and I want you to think about it. Let's say 1% of the people in the area have COVID-19. Imagine you take a PCR test, the swab test, right? The one that goes up your nose. Now, let's just assume the accuracy of the test is 90%. I got that number from the COVID-19 task force from the White House, saying that their goal is for all PCR tests to be accurate at least 90% of the time. So what does that mean? For people who are infected and take the test, 90% of the test will say positive. And for people who are not infected and take the test, 90% of those tests will say negative. So you have a positive test. What is your best estimate of the probability that you have COVID-19? Is it A, less than a 10% chance? B, between 10% and 49%? C, between 50 and 90%? D, greater than a 90%? So just take a second, think about that answer for yourself. And I want you to do a gut check. What's your best estimate? Is it A, less than 10%? So you take it, you don't know if you have it. 1% of the people in your area have it. 90% accuracy. What does that mean if you've got a positive test? So if you're like most people will end up saying about C, right? Between 50 and 90%. In fact, the correct answer is A, less than a 10% chance. If you got that answer wrong, you're not alone. Many people get that answer wrong. In fact, when they've done studies, even medical doctors get this question wrong. And I'm going to illustrate how we can show you what the right answer is, and actually that'll illustrate my point. So to show you the answer, let's imagine the case in which there's 1,000 people. There's 1,000 people, and 10 people are infected. And if it's a 1%, right, that means 10 people are infected and 990 people are not infected. Okay, so that just splits up that 1,000 people. Now, of those 10 people, right, if there's a 90% accuracy rate, then 9 people who give the test will have a positive, and 1 person will have a negative, right? So that just happens, there's an error. Now, what about the other side? Well, I said 90% accuracy rate, right? So if these people are not infected, 90% of the time, 891 out of 990 will test negative. But that also means 10% will test positive, 99 people. So now the question you have, when you test positive, what is the probability of infected given the test says positive? And that is 9 over 9 plus 999. Okay, oops, meaning about 8% chance. Now, when I first did this, and I did it with my wife and others, it actually made me go back and redo the math, right? Because it's a little surprising. You think 90% accuracy, right? But then all it does is get you to 8%. I'll come back to this, but one thing to remember is we started with a base rate of 1%. So there's only 10 out of 1,000 people, right, that have it to begin with, right? So it did increase your probability, right? Your base guess is 1%, and now you're at 8%. You can also do the other calculation is what's the probability that you're not infected given the test says negative? This one says 891 over 1 plus 891, right? So there's 1 person that tests negative who actually has it, and 891 over here. And now you can be quite confident, right? 99.9% positive probability that you're not infected. So hopefully this illustrates that what I want you to see is actually by putting these numbers in absolute terms, relative frequency, we can actually work through the math and just understand what that means. So put these risks in absolute numbers. I also hope this shows you that when the prevalence of infection is low and you have a pretty accurate test, a positive test provides information, right? But it does not convey a lot of confidence in infection. In contrast, a negative test provides more confidence in not being infected. Now, what I want you to do, I don't want you to do going out and say, okay, I tested positive, that doesn't mean I don't have it. That's not what I said. It's just new evidence. And so this is one of the important aspects about testing, right? This means that actually going and getting a second test. Or it also means looking for symptoms, right? This is just a random person that gets tested. So you want to collect more data. This also should illustrate something from tip 1. The reference class matters. So what happens if the prevalence is not 1%, but 30%? We can quickly do the math, right? Now we have 1,000 people, 300 people, that means 270 people. Now, if the prevalence is 30%, then it's 79% chance that you test positive, then it's a 79%, and the probability that you're not infected and it tests negative is 95%. So the prevalence or the reference class matters. And this goes back to the first point, right? So if you are like in a fraternity or sorority where it's spreading, then you actually have to think about, no, actually, the reference class I'm thinking about isn't just the random person, but is actually from a particular house that I am a part of. So that's my second tip, put risks in absolute numbers. The third tip is that balance your everyday experiences with descriptions of the risk. So let me illustrate what I mean here. And actually, this is research that we've been doing. And I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to look at it. So I have two options. Option A, where you lose $3 for certain, or option B, you lose $32 with a probability of 0.1, otherwise lose nothing. Which would you choose? Would you choose to lose $3 for certain, or would you go with the shot of losing $32 with a probability of 0.1, otherwise lose nothing? Which one would you choose? Most people choose A. This is kind of like buying insurance, right? You're like, okay, I'm just going to take that fixed cost because that really bad event of losing $32 really stinks. Now I have a new decision I want you to make. And now I want you to see there's two money machines in a way up here, option A and option B. I'm going to press the button and they're going to generate outcomes from them. As I generate outcomes, I want you to form a preference about which one you would choose. Okay, so I'm going to generate it. Okay, -3, 0, -3, 0. I'm just hitting the button, -3, 0, -3, 0, -3, 0. Oh, -32, -3, -3, 0, -3, 0. Okay, now which one would you choose? Would you choose option A or option B? Now, when we do this data collection, we actually see that people tend to choose option B. The key is these are the exact same gambles. One of them I told you made by description what it is, and the other one you made by experience. Here's the general choice proportions for this, right? So if you get a description, 36% of the time people choose the gamble, but in experience, 85% choose the gamble. This is a general tendency that we started to learn about, is that when people make decisions from description, they tend to overweight rare events. But when people make decisions from experience, they tend to underweight rare events. So there's a 32 with a probability of 0.1. I'm just going to go back. And in general, when they make a decision from description, they overweight this rare event. But when they learn about this gamble from experience, they tend to underweight rare event. This drives a lot of preferences people have, right? You can think of it as, maybe why people buy lottery tickets, right? They learn about the probabilities via description about winning, right? And they overweight the rare event. But it could also maybe explain by why people might buy insurance, right? Where people underweight the rare event, right? Or maybe why they don't buy insurance. I think this is super important in the context that we're all living, right? To some degree, we have decision from description that we've all become accustomed to, that we go to the newspaper or our favorite website that lists the kind of the case rate, or in this case, the deaths reported per day. I pulled this up yesterday. Here's the US death rate, right? It's in many ways quite depressing, right? In that we're still we're basically just averaging 1,000 deaths per day. And maybe you hear that on the news, but this distribution really drives that home. There isn't a difference, right? Notice October, September, July. There's a dip down in June. There's this huge dip that we all experienced in April, but there's 1,000 people dying a day. That's different than the decisions from experience that you and I are making when we go out in the world, right? We're not seeing those deaths. We're not seeing the cases. Instead, when it opens up, we go to Chipotle and we see everyone's healthy and not wearing masks, right? And it seems fine. So what's the right answer? I don't think there's a right answer here. There's not an answer like, oh, we should all be making decisions from experience, or we should all be making decisions from description. In fact, I would actually tell you that we should, I think we should actually kind of learn to temper our decisions from experience from the decision from description. Because we actually know one other thing. As people make more and more decisions from experience and gain experience tends to trump the descriptions, right? So we tend to go with the experience. But now what we need to do is keep refreshing ourselves. Make sure you look at the data and understand what the case rates are in your community, and really get a kind of a glass of face of fresh water to make sure we understand them. Okay. So balance your everyday experiences with descriptions of the risk. Now I'm going to get to my fourth tip here. I'm probably going a little bit over. I think I'm a little bit close to time, but I think we'll be good. So help establish new norms for imitation. So this is my toolbox, right? And I opened this thing talking about the toolboxes that we all have in our mind. I'm kind of a mechanic. My father and my grandfather were electrical mechanics, electrical engineers. So I have some electrical stuff that I know about. I would argue that in our mind, heuristics are one of the most important types of decision-making tools that we have for navigating uncertainty. What's a heuristic? This is something that we've all thought about. And in fact, Einstein actually gave us basically the definition of a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb or an approximation. Einstein used heuristics in his papers, rules of thumb. Mathematicians do it all the time, right? They give you a little trick to solve that particular equation that you might not know. The trick with heuristics is that it doesn't always produce the correct answer, and it often ignores some information, right? So that's why in math class, you learn little rules of thumb or heuristics that you use. We also have all sorts of heuristics or rules of thumb that we might use, right? So when I was a bike mechanic, I learned that you're supposed to, if you go learn about how to tighten a wrench or tighten an axle bolt, an axle nut on a wheel, right? You're supposed to tighten it to a particular torque, but you don't have a torque wrench laying around. So the heuristics I was taught was tighten it to the point in which the writing on the wrench would imprint on your hand, right? So that's a rule of thumb. There's all sorts of heuristics that we've learned. One of them is called imitation. Imitation is something that we've all grown accustomed to. We look for others, right? So I have a colleague that studies how we navigate crowds. And one way we navigate crowds, right? So if you're in a foreign country and you get off the subway and you try, or you're in a different place, you get off the bus and you don't know where to go, you follow a person because they're going to take you to an exit. This imitation heuristic is a powerful thing. In fact, this is another colleague of mine, Annie Wertz, and what she has studied is children and infants. And what she has found is something really interesting, that infants from an early age actually avoid plants. And she has an evolutionary story about why, or evolutionary account about why that is. Makes some sense, right? Like plants, most plants are dangerous. There's some that we can eat. And so it makes evolutionary sense to avoid them. But then the question is, how do infants learn to eat the plants or like the plants? And what she has found is that we have found that infants look more often to adults when they first encounter plants in the time before touching them, suggesting that behavioral avoidance strategies operate in concert with social learning processes. In other words, the infants learn to imitate. This illustrates something, right? A heuristics policy represents a wager on the structure of the environment. It bets that ignoring some of the available information will enable faster and potentially even more accurate decisions. So the infant is betting by using the imitation heuristic that I can just look at my parent to learn, right? This bet, though, requires the environment to be stable. If the environment shifts or suddenly changes, then all bets are off. So if we're using this imitation, right, the infant is betting that in a way, the plants, right, there's not going to be a sudden change in what's dangerous or not, right? That's a reasonable, stable environment. So the imitation heuristic is making that bet. Now here's the catch. Everything in our world has changed, right? So actually, this is the plot this summer of the deaths attributed to COVID-19. Here you can see the United States where we were about 90 days out. I replotted this recently, yesterday. Here's where we are now, right? Unfortunately, we have really reached a steady state, but I don't think anyone expected us to stay there. I think we were all optimistic that we would maybe follow China, maybe follow Germany. We haven't, right? We're at a flat plateau. So what does this mean? I think the idea isn't to give you new heuristics, but we can do things to help foster the heuristics that we are all using. So one thing we can all do is help establish new norms for imitation. So an example here is masks. Masks work, right? So this is a nice illustration maybe you've seen on the website, out on the internet, showing you what happens when you wear a mask and don't wear a mask. There's actually really nice work out of IPSR from KU that came out this week, showing you that the case rate for counties in Kansas went from, was decreased, I think it was 14 out of 100,000 to 7 out of 100,000 for when counties used a mask mandate. So masks work. And because our environment has changed, we need to update our norms so that our heuristics like imitation can help us survive and thrive in our world. So wear a mask, because it'll help, and maybe even help not only you save your relatives, but also help your neighbors who are imitating you save their family. So these are the 4 tips. Get a reference class, put risks in absolute numbers, balance your everyday experience with the description of the risk, and help establish new norms for imitation. So I hope these tips are ways that can kind of help you realize the tools you have at hand and better use them to deal with risk during the pandemic. I would also tell you that I hope that you've also kind of given this idea, and what we've learned as we've studied uncertainty, this is a book we've recently written, is that the human mind has developed a set of tools and the ability to acquire new ones that empower us with what the poet John Keats called negative capability, the ability to survive and thrive in uncertainty. So I don't take a doom and gloom. I think we can make it. We have all sorts of, we've faced uncertainty throughout our civilization. We can do it. We just need to understand how we deal with uncertainty and go forward. I would also point out, if you're interested, there's a bunch of great resources of some of my colleagues. Calculated Risk, Perfectly Confident by Don Moore, Innumeracy in the Wild. Ellen Peters, she has a great Twitter feed if you're interested about statistics and understanding how people process numbers. There's this nice website called COVID Explained that I would point you to. And there's also this Deciphering the Pandemic, a guide to understanding the coronavirus. These are all great resources if you're interested about how to deal with those. So with that, I'll stop and open it up for any questions, if anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Pleskac. We will now move on to the Q&A session. So if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A box or raise your hand and we'll get to you. So it looks like Dennis Daly has the first question. I'll let you unmute yourself and ask it in person. Dennis, I think you have to unmute yourself before you ask your question. Or if you're having technical, okay, there you go.
This may be a little off topic, but I'm wondering what the relationship is between risk/uncertainty and depression.
That's a really good question. There's different, so they're quite different things. I think about risk and uncertainty as things that are external, right? That we just don't know. Depression is a mental state, but there's actually some link, right, about how people deal with uncertainty and think about that. So in depression, we tend to perseverate about different outcomes. And so I think there can be a link in how people deal with the risk and uncertainty. And we know that, for example, depressives actually tend to search less information out and perseverate on that. And that can lead to kind of harder ways to deal with risk and uncertainty because we need you to be searching. And so I think there's some link between those two things. And I think in the context of the pandemic, this is something that we have to, I haven't thought about as much, but I think it's something really important, right? And I would think about these tools, right? To what degree can we help people who are depressives kind of thinking about this risk and uncertainty and understand putting them in context? To some degree, you might think of it as a decision from description versus decision from experience distinction, right? Depressive don't search as much. And so that can lead you to make very different decisions from experience if they're not searching very much. So that's the link that I would see. There's a question and answer. How many people die by flu in the U.S.? How many people die by car accidents in the U.S.? Please compare COVID-19 and other cases. It seems to be exaggerating. I don't have the statistics on deaths or car accidents in the U.S., but I'm pretty confident that the death rate for the COVID-19 is above that of flu. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. And I think that's one of the things we're dealing with right now.
I have a question. Oh, Scott, you can go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Sergey. So in the example that you used of sort of like the 1%, right? I mean, I know that was just an example for demonstration purposes. And with the flu, for instance, we can establish every year, like X percentage of people will get the flu based on data from previous years. But with something with a new virus, like how do we establish, sort of at the beginning that a percentage of people are likely to have it?
Yeah, this is a great question. This has been, I mean, this is what public health people are like struggling with, right? Both in the prevalence rate, and this is where you're seeing that people are like, we just don't know how to answer that question because it's so new. The way you do it is you collect data, right? The same thing is true with accuracy rates of the tests, right? Not only just the prevalence, but the accuracy rate. So if you think about it, in November, there was no such, we just didn't even have that data. There was no, like this talk would be meaningless at something, like I didn't have a number for that, right? And actually one of the things that I still think we're struggling with is not only is understanding the accuracy of these tests. So if you go on and you look up, I did this yesterday, again, trying to find this, right? There's the one study that is published is from China, showing you fairly disparate ways in terms of the accuracy of tests, anywhere between, I think, in terms of errors, 2% to 25 to 30%. And so that's a real challenge. And I think, but the way you address this is with public health, you do studies. That's why we're doing with vaccines, but also with testing to assess the accuracy. And then that in turn leads you to estimates of the prevalence. So once you start to estimate those, we have models then that estimate the prevalence of those. But Scott, you've identified the challenge. And I think hopefully you see the numbers and now you can see like, okay, we know how to treat, now is one of these questions, like we know how to think about the flu, right? Because we kind of have a sense of how accurate these tests are. We actually know that. But here we just have lots of uncertainty. And then you're seeing how people are dealing with that now. And that's a real struggle. There's another question.
Mr. Daly, were you asking another question? Okay, I was actually gonna ask that question to Scott, who stole mine, but I wanna ask one that I think I've asked you, Tim, before is, what happens if you test multiple times and they both come back positive?
That's a good question. Actually, I'm gonna share my screen one more time. I think, is it this one? Yeah. That's a great question. Because actually you can see this. This is one of the important things I want to think about, right? Is that the tests are data. And that's what you should think of it. So this plot shows you a probability on the y-axis. And the x-axis is the prior probability of infection from 0 to 100%. Okay. Now, the example I gave is 1%. So you start at 1%, and then we ended up at like 8%. But there's a saying, this is actually Bayes' rule. And what Bayes' rule says is that yesterday's posterior is today's prior. Meaning, so now we went from 1% to 8%. Now let's just imagine the situation where you just turn around and you get another test, right? So now your base rate is now at 8%. And then if you get a positive test under the exact same test, you're going to get closer to 50%. If you then take a third test, right, etc. And so you can see how you move along the spectrum as you increase the data, as your prior probability changes. You can also see the prevalence rate, right? So that this is where informing your prior can be quite important, and understanding your prior. You can also see what happens with probability of non-infection given a negative test, right? So here, if hardly anyone has it, it's very little, right? But if you keep as somehow the probability increases, it decreases. So the point is, when you test positive, we need to think of that as data and then collect more data. And I think that's something that maybe isn't as well communicated, that we have to be cautious, right? There was questions about false positives recently. And I think that's just the nature of testing. And there's a healthy aspect to it, right? And I think we also have to appreciate that, hey, when you could test positive, and that could be right, but it could be wrong. And you could also test negative, and that could be right and could be wrong. There's also the place where then pursuing more accurate tests, right? Is this tests is a vehicle, and that's also a tool to all this.
I have another question, actually.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, you talked about sort of like the shade tree mechanic. And oftentimes sort of like when you're a shade tree mechanic, like the place that you turn to for information is your friends or YouTube, for instance. I mean, you can find a video on how to repair anything.
Yep.
But, in cases of sort of like public health, the information is full, or the internet is full of all sorts of information that isn't accurate. And I think that, what you end up relying on is, like what your experience is and what your friends' experiences are. And maybe information, whether it's we seek out the information that we want to believe. And I think that's how maybe you end up in situations like what you saw at Sturgis motorcycle rally, right?
Yes.
People rely on the information that they have, and then they combine that with their own personal experiences. So how do we prevent people who are maybe like being safe in their small personal experiences from, I don't know what, like misinterpreting their own experiences and data?
This is an excellent question, Scott. And I guess a couple of things I would say, right, is that this is the shade tree mechanic. You hit it right on the head, right? Is that like the shade tree mechanic has lots of other things, right? The shade tree mechanic calls up his friend and is like, I don't know how to fix this particular thing. Have you ever ran into this, right? So this is this is something that we've all grown and is an adaptive aspect in many areas, right? We all kind of ask our friends. The same thing with retirement accounts, right? So there used to be this old saying is that like the best predictor of your like how you distribute your retirement savings is basically either someone that handed it to you, you kind of say, well, how do you do it? Or you might actually maybe talk to a friend or a neighborhood, right? And so the way they fixed it with retirement accounts is to try to improve the defaults and improve who you can talk to find out how you should allocate those retirement accounts. And I guess I would say the same thing. To what degree can we shape the environment to facilitate those things? So the surges, you know, to some degree, that's what I'm trying to say is that we need to change the norms that people can imitate from. We're never going to be able to tell people, a heuristic people have all kind of grown to use is calling up, insulting their friend. But if we can kind of buffer it with other areas around them that realize, you know what, that friend, you know, had some bad advice for me, right? You learn it when you're a mechanic, right? You kind of learn that friend, he says he knows a little bit, but he didn't work. The wheel came off, right? So if, to a degree, we can buffer that. And I'll say that having actually about a month and a half ago, I went through South Dakota. And one of the things I noticed was actually in the places I stopped, there was a prevalence of people wearing masks. I was pretty impressed. And I think that's our best. Never going to be able to like tell people don't do that, but hopefully by kind of setting up good models, and hopefully we're seeing that, right? When people are hopefully starting to see that, okay, you know, these things are working. I hope that will work, but I guess I'm less paternalistic. I don't want to like mandate and say you have to wear a mask. I hope that we should set those rules, but I don't know if that's going to be enforceable. But I think thinking of the norms is an important aspect. I'm kind of stuck. Any other questions today?
Doesn't look like it, Scott.
Yeah, okay, so I have one more question. So you know, the sort of like the gator masks became really popular. Okay, I have two questions actually. So well, they're about the same, about gator masks. You know, gator masks I think were pretty popular for a segment of the population, and then it turned out that they weren't effective. And I'm wondering, one, if you know sort of like anything about the science of that, because it seemed that they weren't effective because they were stopping smaller molecules, but the larger molecules were getting through. So I'm kind of curious about that. And I know you're not a public health expert, so maybe you don't. But then also, so there was a lot of, and there were a lot of articles about how the gator masks don't work. But then I was like listening to 96.5 radio station, and they were saying that other studies have been published that sort of discounted or rebuffed that initial study.
Yep.
So, but I saw a lot of sources that I trust saying that gator masks don't work, and one source that I don't trust saying that they do. So again, my question is sort of like one about like how those sort of molecules work.
Yeah.
And secondly, sort of about like information trust and what your advice is there.
Okay, so I will confess that in the beginning I was one of the because I didn't have a mask, so I had a gator, and that's what I put on, right? Actually, I actually had the same question as you. I know the original study that came out was one of the things that's happened, and I think maybe the public has now better appreciated, is that there's preprints, meaning, you know, there's a review process. Scientific review takes a long time, and so what you're seeing is some of the science is coming out are preprints. But the one thing with that particular study that kind of got prominent really quickly, it was a sample of one person basically developed a way to test the effectiveness of different masks. And what they were talking about was the way to test that. And they used the gator mask as an illustration of how much seems to get through. And so this is one of the things I would say in terms of trusting scientific communication is we have to become better consumers. Understand, we have to, and also we have to push our news outlets to be better evaluators of science. And now that's unfair, maybe, but it is something that we're all digesting and trying to figure out. And so when they talk about that, rather than going after the sensational art thing, it's still worrisome. And I believe that article's probably got some truth to it. However, the issue was it was just a sample of one. So we don't know. And actually, I don't know if I can speak to it. I had the same question recently as I was wondering, has anyone, I haven't seen any new published papers about the effectiveness of those gator masks, of just how much it actually seems to cut it down. So I can't speak to that other than I've actually had a similar question, but I would say in terms of scientific communication, I would push, and also like thinking about data literacy and numeracy, thinking about, okay, when someone tells you a piece of information, not only thinking about things like the probability of what does that mean? What reference class does that mean? But to the degree possible, finding out where, like trying to look at that original piece of information and asking, is the news person that is communicating that, do they seem to have a good understanding of what's going on? And I actually kind of was alarmed initially, and I'm still alarmed by gators, but it was also alarming that, okay, wait a minute, that original paper was really something else, some other things. And there's been a number of other arguments that have come out, like with preprints, where it gets sensational. So I think in terms of scientific communication, we need to learn how to be better consumers of that. I guess one of them would be look at just like I said, of the reference class, look at the sample size that they're talking about. Get used to like, wait a minute, how many people did you do that study on? Same thing with the accuracy of the tests. The accuracy of the tests in some of these drug companies, they're basing it on like samples of 30 people. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. It's information, but it's a lot of uncertainty that we have to learn how to kind of process and think about. And so I guess that's my recipe of thinking about that, is you can maybe take some of these tips and apply it to those, like of what, where did that data come from, right? And what is it? And see if that's being communicated. And I would push journalists to do the same thing. They need to do a better job of communicating this information to all of us.
All right. Well, unless we have any other questions, thank you so much, Dr. Pleskac, for your talk and for answering our questions. This presentation was recorded and will be sent out in DCM newsletter, and I believe also posted to the website. And our next, you can also find us at ecm@ku.org. And on that website, you can find our social media outlets as well. Cool. And our next presentation is on November 10th. And it's actually going to be a bit later in the day. I think it's going to be 6:30 p.m. And we'll have Kai Reed, who is a special education teacher in the Douglas County District, talk about their experience with their job during the COVID pandemic and the whole education system right now. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much.